All right, welcome back. It is time for another one of our sponsors, and that sponsor is University Clinical Health. University Clinical Health Addiction Medicine offers outpatient care for people with opioid, alcohol, and other substance use disorders. In addition to our physician-provided services, our clinic offers counseling, evaluation of mental health issues, case management, and peer support services. Our team works together to develop and maintain an addiction treatment practice that stays relevant, demonstrates success rates higher than the national average, and invests in the lives of people who need it the most. We accept most commercial insurance plans, as well as Medicare Advantage, Medicare, and Medicaid. Additionally, we accept Cover Kids and CHAMP VA TRICARE. We offer charity care to help patients who need assistance affording treatment. Further, we partner with First Step Recovery to provide IOP programming and support for the cost of office visits and prescription medications for those who qualify. Our hours are Monday through Friday from 8 to 4:30, and we are located at 6401 Poplar Avenue, Suite 500. We look forward to serving you at UCH Addiction Medicine. Trey and Kim and Elizabeth Harcourt at UT Clinical Health are community partners of ours, and they are a huge asset to what we do here at the Coalition and a huge asset to the community. And now we are going to hear from our sponsor, Bradford Health Services.
By the beauty of your life, I have seen a miracle. I have seen a miracle.
What we want to do when patients and families are coming in is give them hope and say this is a very treatable disease.
There is so much hope in recovery.
It's not just the person that's homeless or the person that is at the end of the rope using IV drugs. They're very successful businessmen, businesswomen, healthcare professionals.
I had a great job, we owned our own home.
I went to the Birmingham School of Law.
I was actually in the military.
Addiction is an equal opportunity destroyer.
20 years old, I was shooting IV cocaine and opioids.
IV heroin, but if I didn't have that, I would do pretty much anything.
Either I was going to end up drinking myself to death, or I was just going to end up taking my own life at some point. The person on the end of the phone was understanding, compassionate.
They just asked me questions about how much I was drinking and how it was affecting my life.
There are a lot of things that can happen if you make the phone call, and the only thing that's going to happen if you don't is the same thing that's been happening.
The earth is here, it's here for you. 7 fish, the owls too. And there you are, like you are, feeling so natural. Find your blue-eyed way, my darling, we'll guide you, but you'll find it on your own.
I never dreamed that I would be able to really have the life that I get to have today.
My son will be 4 in April, and he's never seen me drink or use a drug.
I run a women's sober living facility. It's a way for me to give back. I'm passionate about what I do, and it all started here.
My family is back in my life. I love my job.
After leaving Bradford, I got granted with the opportunity to go back to the University of Alabama.
I can sleep because I don't have fear. I don't run on fear and pain anymore, and I wake up with peace every day.
The true, lasting bonds that I have with individuals that I love dearly and care for in my life are proof that recovery is possible for anyone.
My life today is amazing.
Why?
I get to show up for my family today.
been here a long time. I think that stands for a lot.
Blessed days with you in the corner of my arm. I have seen a miracle. I have seen
There is a way out,
a miracle.
but it all started with the first phone call that I made to Bradford.
Oh, farewell. By the beauty of your life.
Bradford Health Services has been serving individuals with substance use disorders for over 40 years. With medical detox, residential, extended care, and outpatient treatment options, Bradford is able to tailor treatment plans to meet patients wherever they are in their recovery. Across their families of facilities, Bradford is in network with most major commercial insurance policies. We are so grateful for Bradford and for Debbie Coy and Nora Cheney over at Bradford. I've posted Nora's contact information on the screen. She answers my calls all the time and has been a great asset for us at our SSP and just here at the Coalition. And of course, Bradford has a special place in my heart because I am an alumni. I'm not only a client, I'm also the president, or however it used to say. All right, so we have one final speaker. Thank you so much for attending today. We hope that you all have had a wonderful, educational, and entertaining day. I'm going to turn it back over to Olivia. After this next speaker, we will have a couple more sponsor spotlights, and then we'll have our closing remarks. And we look forward to seeing you all in person at the next conference in October. And Olivia is going to tell you a little bit more about that.
All right, we have one more speaker today. His name is David Fuller. David has over 8 years of experience working with clients with substance use disorders, particularly opioid use disorder, primarily in outpatient settings as an alcohol and drug counselor, peer recovery specialist, and group facilitator. He now works with the wonderful people at the Memphis Area Prevention Coalition as the Regional Overdose Prevention Specialist. Please join me in welcoming David Fuller.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you to everybody for attending this conference today. So what I'm going to talk with you guys about is overdose prevention. And so a little bit about me. My name is David Fuller. I've been with the Prevention Coalition since the beginning of the year. And I am a CPRS, which for those of y'all that don't know, I'm a certified peer recovery specialist. And so what that means is that I am a person in recovery. And to be more specific, I'm a person in recovery from opioid use disorder. So there's a lot of information in this that the state likes us to go over. Some of the sections have been covered or partially covered by some of the previous speakers, so I won't spend as much time on those as maybe I normally would. There is a lot of information here, and I'm going to try to make sure we have a few minutes in case there's any questions. So, I'm going to start with, I'm going to talk about some statistics about the overdose epidemic that we're facing. And there's a lot of good data and numbers and stuff in this presentation, but I like to try to humanize it a little bit more. And the previous speaker did a fantastic job of that. As well. So, of course, we want to make sure everybody understands what we've been talking about all day, and I'm sure most people do. Opioids and medications and drugs that bind to the natural opiate receptor sites that we all have in our brain. Yes, there's street drugs, there's prescription drugs, and then of course stimulants. They increase activity in the body, especially alertness and energy. Again, street drugs and prescription drugs, and an overdose is just simply a toxic amount of a drug or a combination of drugs that overwhelms the body. So before we get into what this looks like today, like to give a little bit of background, a little bit of history of how we got here. This overdose epidemic is not new. It didn't just happen in the last couple of years, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware of that. This has been going on for a long time now. This overdose epidemic, which has primarily been an opioid epidemic, but certainly encompasses more than that, especially these days, really started back in the mid-90s. And again, I know some of you guys are familiar with this story. 1996, a pharmaceutical manufacturer called Purdue Pharma came out with a new powerful opiate medication called Oxycontin. And it was a high dose oxycodone pill. And this drug company told America, told the doctors, that it had a very, very low potential for addiction and for abuse. And of course, today we know that they were lying when they said that, and we know today that they knew they were lying when they said it. And we know that they had somebody inside the FDA that approved them to put this label on this medication that said it was very low potential for addiction. And that person left the FDA shortly after the drug and the messaging was approved, and they went to work for Purdue Pharma for big money. So, as I mentioned, I'm a person in recovery, and to be an overdose prevention specialist, you either have to be a nurse or a person in recovery, or both. And so, telling the story of how we got here has a whole lot to do with a lot of my life. I've lived through pretty much all of this in one way or another. Yes, I've been around treatment and recovery for a pretty long time. But before that, I was around drugs for a pretty long time. So I'm not from Memphis originally. I'm from Northeast Alabama. And where I'm from, the story that I'm going to tell you, it happened in a lot of places, especially in the South, the Midwest, and the Northeast. Where I'm from was a working town. We had a steel mill, a Goodyear plant, right? A lot of working folks. We also had a lot of elderly people. Cost of living's low. It's very pretty. There's a river, there's lakes, there's mountains. So we had a lot of working folks, a lot of elderly people. What does that mean? That means a lot of injuries, a lot of illnesses, a lot of doctors, a lot of pain doctors. And so when this drug Oxycontin came out, I was a teenager in high school, and I was a drug user, and a lot of the people that I hung out with were drug users. And maybe within a year or two, we began to see this Oxycontin drug on the streets. And it was literally one day somebody told you about it, you had never heard of it before, and a month later it was everywhere. And again, this was happening all over our country. There were literally hundreds of these pills being prescribed for every man, woman, and child, you know, in the city and the county where I'm from. And a lot of people became addicted to these medications, either through their doctors or, such as myself, through the streets. I lost my first friend to a drug overdose on Christmas Day 2000. He was a very good friend of mine named Anthony. And it was a very tragic situation. Of course, his parents found him deceased on Christmas morning, and he was their only child. And what was even sadder that we couldn't have known at the time is he was the first of many. And in the course of around a year or so, we lost 12 or 15 people, young people, early 20s, late teens, to drug overdoses in a town of 40,000 people. And again, this was happening all over, and it kept happening, and it kept happening. I went to my first funeral as a sober person just 4 or 5 years later, and a lifelong friend of mine named Molly had passed away from a drug overdose. And in between, there were dozens and dozens. And again, this was happening all over. It kept happening. Finally, Congress stepped in, the government stepped in after a number of years of this and said, we have to do something. And so they began to make new laws, and they had the drug manufacturer change it, made it harder to abuse, they made it harder to get. And there's a lot of good documentaries out there about this if you're interested in more information. Hulu came out with a show fairly recently called Dope Sick, starring Michael Keaton and Rosario Dawson, among others. It's very good if you haven't seen it. HBO did a documentary called Crime of the Century, where it talks about Purdue Pharma and Oxy. And then in the second half of that documentary, it talks about a company called Insys, who pushed fentanyl products on America, and they got in a bunch of trouble as well. There's also The Pharmacist, which was on Netflix, about a father who was a pharmacist who lost his son to an overdose, and kind of he went about to figure out what was going on. And then there's also a documentary called OxyContin Express, and it's specifically about the pill mills in Florida. Florida was a sort of a haven for all these pill mills, and people would go from all over the country, and they would stand in line for hours and hours overnight, all through the day. And as long as you had cash in your hand, you could walk in and get a prescription for just about anything you wanted. So the government stepped in finally after 15, 20 years of this stuff going on, and they tried to do something about it, and they made the pills harder to get and harder to abuse. But by this point, there was tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans who were addicted to powerful opiates. And about that same time, we were fighting a couple of wars, including one in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, of course, is a producer of the poppy plant, which is what heroin is made of. And so heroin began to come in the country more so than it had in probably at least several decades, going back to Vietnam. And so a lot of people who were addicted to pharmaceutical opiates that couldn't find them, they couldn't afford them, were now being offered a powder that was cheaper and more powerful. And that powder was heroin, and a lot of people switched to heroin. And so the overdose deaths continued to rise, because now there's a illicit street drug involved. That continued on for a few years. And then we began to see street fentanyl just a few years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And unfortunately, the epidemic has gotten even worse, because fentanyl is even cheaper and more powerful than heroin. People started ordering it online, the dark web from China. It took off. Cartels got involved. It's coming into this country in bulk, and it's the predominant opiate on the street now. And it's the most powerful opiate we've ever seen on the street. And so this epidemic has continued to get worse as we go. And so you can kind of see this bear out in the statistics for the state of Tennessee as well as Memphis. You can see overdose deaths over the last decade involving prescription opioids stayed relatively stable. 700, 750 people a year die in the state of Tennessee from a drug overdose that includes prescription opiates. Heroin began to come in, as I said, about 10 years ago. That number of overdose deaths involving heroin began to rise up, but then it plateaued out, and it plateaued out because of the fentanyl. And you see that gray line there that shows you just the absolute steep increase in overdose deaths that have happened in our state, in our city, and all over the country in the last 6, 7 years. But we've also seen a rise in overdose deaths involving a stimulant, and you see that there with the blue line, especially just in the last 4 or 5 years. In the state of Tennessee, as well as pretty much across the country, 2 out of the 3 overdose deaths that we're seeing involve fentanyl. And this isn't the pharmaceutical fentanyl that the companies were pushing a decade ago. Again, this stuff's being made in labs in China, and it's not as stable, and it's hard to know exactly what you're getting. So this breaks down 2020. Over 3,000 Tennesseans that we know of, that number is actually higher, died from a drug overdose. That was almost a 50% increase. 2021, the number is going to keep going up. Unfortunately, 2022, the number is probably going to keep going up. 2/3 involve fentanyl, which was almost a double from 2019. Stimulants are there, 35, 40%, which was almost a 50% increase. Heroin's not gone. Prescription pain relievers certainly aren't gone. And you can see, yes, it's concentrated in our metro areas, but it's in our suburbs, it's in our rural areas. This is happening everywhere. Shelby County, the numbers are very similar, except that the fentanyl percentage is even higher, more in the 70s. And a lot of people, of course, are overdosing on more than one type of drug, multiple opioids or an opioid and a stimulant. And people are still receiving opiate prescriptions, nowhere near the number of 15, 20 years ago, but there's still a lot of opioids prescribed in this country. It says here that we know of over 2,100 non-fatal drug overdoses in Shelby County alone in 2020. That number is definitely a good bit higher, because of course they're not all reported. So we've had a number of speakers talk about addiction, the science of addiction. So I won't spend as much time on this as perhaps I normally would, but I do want to mention a couple of things, right? In the 1950s, the American Medical Association said that alcoholism/addiction was a medical disease. Never before in human history had any official body or person of any type come out and said that alcoholism or addiction was an actual medical disease. Before that, people with substance use disorders, such as myself, were considered to be weak-willed, morally bad, maybe even evil, just didn't care, could stop if we wanted to, right? But then people began to recognize that it is an actual medical disease. We know even more about it today than we did 70, 80 years ago, but we don't know everything, right? We're always learning more about how this works. But we do know that it's a brain disease, right? And just like heart disease damages the heart, a brain disease will damage the brain. Addiction does damage the brain. The good news I like to share with clients, people who are in recovery, early recovery, particularly, is that a lot of this damage does heal back, thankfully, over the course of 12 to 24 months, as long as the person is in recovery and no longer using. But not necessarily all of the damage heals back, of course. So you've had a lot of good information today about this, like I said, but I do want to highlight the role of dopamine, right? The neurotransmitter messenger in our reward system, right? And of course, humans, we all have this reward system that we evolved over time to reward good behavior that was good for the species. And so most people, right, enjoy good food. They enjoy the company of people they like. They enjoy sex. Why? Because it feels good. Our brain tells us that it feels good, right? If we eat, we stay alive. If we come together as little groups and tribes, we can survive. And if we have sex, we continue the species. What happens in addiction, one of the things that happens is that it hijacks this reward system, right? And particularly in people that are more susceptible, people that have abnormal responses to chemicals, right? A normal response to opioids when somebody takes them is they actually don't feel that good. My mother's like that. She takes a painkiller. She won't if she absolutely had to. It doesn't feel good. She feels groggy. She feels nauseous. It's not a pleasurable experience. But those of us who have that abnormal reaction, when we put a painkiller, an opioid into our body, the opposite happens. Get a lot of energy and feel tremendous, right? There's this huge dopamine release that was happening in the brain. Obviously, people that are using aren't necessarily aware of that, especially early on. I wasn't. This huge dopamine, my brain did not know what I was putting into my body. But when I put that in and that dopamine release happened, my brain said, ooh, whatever you just did was the best and most important thing you've ever done, and we need to do that again. I said, okay. And I did, right? And of course, what happens over time, we understand, is that dopamine release gets smaller and smaller. So you have to take more drugs. You have to take them more often. You have to get more powerful drugs. At the same time, those smaller dopamine releases that come with normal activities, they begin to get smaller and smaller. Hanging out with friends and family, eating good food, right? All that kind of stuff, these activities that a person used to enjoy before, there's almost no dopamine release at all versus this big dopamine release with drugs. And so what's happening on a neurochemical level is that the getting and the using of drugs becomes absolutely paramount and more important than anything else. And so you see that with this medical disease of substance use disorder, that a person is using not just against their will, but in spite of any other consequences. It becomes more important than anything: family, children, jobs, all that. So we understand another set of factors in why someone develops the substance use disorder are the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, mostly talking about childhood trauma, grief, growing up in households where the adults, become incarcerated or substance users themselves, have untreated mental health disorders. And it says here 61% of children experience at least one of these in their childhood, when they're growing up, and 16% experience 4 or more. And I always pause when I read that and I look at the list again and I see the things that are on the list. And I just think about children growing up with 4 or more of these. And a lot of people do, probably a number of people that are on this presentation right now. And I think about how sad that is. And I think about how tough that is to overcome those types of traumas. And of course, genetics and family history play a role. I mentioned my mother earlier. She's not an addict or an alcoholic. Neither was my father, right? Very fortunate in that. But I had a grandfather, a maternal grandfather. I never met him, not when he was alive, but he was a terrible alcoholic. And I was warned about this as a kid, right? You have this grandfather, he's a terrible drunk, and that's why you've never met him. We don't know where he is. And, this could happen to you too. And obviously I didn't listen. I didn't heed the warnings. But it was there, the genetic predisposition. And we can't know how that's going to express, right? Sometimes it skips a generation. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it may hit 1 out of 3 siblings, or it may hit 3 out of the 3 siblings. But we do know that it plays a role In fact, the National Institute of Drug Abuse says that somewhere between 40 to 60% of a person's vulnerability to addiction to substance use disorder is comprised of their genetics. So that's, roughly half, right? So it does play a big role. Of course, co-occurring disorders, mental health conditions. It says 39% of people with a substance use disorder also have a mental health condition. Now, my experience of being in recovery, of working with people professionally, is that number is certainly much, much higher. In my experience, most everyone that has a substance use disorder had at least either anxiety and or depression present before they ever picked up the substances. And of course, substance use will exacerbate that. It will throw off the neurochemistry even more. So a lot of people are self-medicating, whether they're aware of that or not. And then the last set of factors that comes into why someone develops a substance use disorder is what we call the community level factors: access to education and healthcare, economics, the neighborhood, the people around us, right? And none of these things are guarantees, right? There's people that grow up with every advantage in the world who develop substance use disorders. There are people who grow up with none of the advantages in the world who never do. All of these different things just play a role. They increase the likelihood of someone developing a substance use disorder. Now, if we never put the substances in, we would never trigger the genetics or the various other factors. Stigma and harm reduction is something that has been talked about already. I will point out just a couple of things again on these slides. The first one is it says 40 to 60% will relapse at least once. Once again, my experience says that number is actually a good bit higher. The previous speaker told a wonderful, personal story that really illustrated this. And what I will share with you is that there are certainly people who come into treatment centers, who come into support groups, however their path of recovery, leads them to recovery, and they never relapse, right? They stay that way for years, for decades, and until they pass away. That's not my story. And that's not the story of a lot of people. This is not the first time that I have been in recovery for multiple years. I have relapse in my story. And so what I like to share with clients who are dealing with that, who are trying to come back with that, is that, hey, it happens, right? You're certainly not alone. There's a lot of us. Relapses happen in medical diseases, right? Including addiction. If we're still alive, we still have a chance. If we're still alive, we still have a chance at this thing. And so all we can do is try to learn something and move forward. We all have personal biases about all sorts of different things. I have had to learn to be more aware of those as I go through my journey of a person in recovery and as a person that works in these fields of treatment and prevention. And again, addiction's often connected to trauma, those adverse childhood experiences. These things are very difficult to work on, to overcome. And so a lot of times that will play a role in a relapse. Again, a speaker mentioned earlier, this language matters. What I like to point out about this is that it is about person first language, okay? The person with a substance use disorder, just like a person with diabetes or a person with high blood pressure, whatever the case may be. Being in recovery is something that is a daily thing, but it's not the sum total of who we are, right? I am a person in recovery, but that does not define the totality of me as a human being. I'm also a son, I'm also a brother, I'm also a partner, and now I'm also a father, right? I'm also a coworker, an employee. And so it's about person first, right? People aren't just addicts. They're not just alcoholics. They're persons with substance use disorders who are like everybody else in every other way. Harm reduction, right? This is what we do here with the coalition. Various people have talked about different aspects of this. So harm reduction to me simply is meeting people where they are, trying to keep people alive and as healthy as possible until they're ready to engage in more recovery, engage in treatment, whatever it is that they may need to do. It's meeting people with non-judgment, right? We're all human beings. And again, behavior change is a process and it's difficult. Even the people who get into recovery and stay in recovery without a relapse, that's only the beginning. There's a lot of other behavior changes that are going to come along with that. And it's difficult and it's not linear. A lot of complex factors. We've mentioned that. And so as somebody else mentioned, we want the person to be the primary agent, right? We want people to have agency. MAT. So interestingly enough, while we've been in this conference today, the current administration in Washington has come out with their plan to combat substance use for the next year. And over the last few years, our government has stepped in and done more and more and provided the resources and the funding that allow a lot of us to do what we do. And so it looks like that's going to continue. And one of the main pillars, as they said today, is going to be getting people medications, getting people into treatment. And so MAT, whether we're talking about Suboxone, Vivitrol, methadone, whatever it may be, these things have been studied. They've been shown to keep people alive, to keep people in treatment, to help people get and keep jobs. And they've also been shown to keep people out of the streets, away from criminal activity, away from more dangerous street drugs, and to lower the risk of contracting diseases like hepatitis C and HIV. And so it's good to know that we're going to continue to fund these programs that have been shown to keep people alive and to keep people healthier. That's why we do what we do, right? And so that also, of course, includes syringe service programs, commonly referred to as needle exchanges. And it's been mentioned, we'll continue to mention it. For anyone that doesn't know, we have 5 of these that meet every week in Shelby County. 4 of those are put on by ourselves at the Prevention Coalition. And there's another one put on by an organization called The Better Way. And yes, sterile injection equipment and related supplies are available, but that's not all. There's testing for hepatitis C and HIV. We have those services available here. There's always people available from treatment organizations, various organizations, to help people get the services that they need when they're ready to engage with them. Education and tools for safer behaviors, right? And they've been studied as well. They get people in treatment. They keep people healthier. They keep people alive. They've been shown to reduce the rates of disease in communities. And that's very important here in Memphis. We're towards the top in the rate of new HIV cases. We have these in other areas of Tennessee as well, the metro areas and some of the counties in Northeast Tennessee. So going to get into the main part of this, and that's overdose, right? And so again, toxic amount of drugs, combination of drugs that overwhelms the body. And it can be street drugs, it can be prescription drugs, it can be even over-the-counter drugs. The most important message is that we can prevent deaths. We can keep people alive if we have the right tools and the right information. So we're going to look at that. And we're going to talk mostly about opioid overdoses, but we are going to talk a little bit about stimulant overdoses. So risk factors for an opioid overdose. The number one risk factor has always been, and it continues to be, when someone uses opioids after a period of not using. They've been in recovery, or maybe they've been locked up. They've been somewhere in some situation where they were no longer able to access drugs, or they had chosen not to. And then they relapse or they return to use, and they go back and they pick up. And what tends to happen is when a person relapses, they go back to use, and they go back to what they know, and they get that same drug, that same amount of drug, except their tolerance is reset. It only takes a few weeks for that to begin to happen. And certainly after months or years, tolerance to those substances is reset in the brain. And so that bag of whatever that they used to do now acts like 4 or 5, and it overwhelms them, and they have an overdose. There's a lot of different risk factors, mixing different types of drugs, multiple opioids with stimulants, opiates with other central nervous system depressants like benzodiazepines and alcohol. And then now today we have something that we'd never seen before these last couple of years, and that's the counterfeit drugs and the lace drugs, to the extent that we're seeing them, right? And we're mostly talking about fentanyl. Again, this is the strongest opiate we've ever seen on the streets, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. It's being laced onto not just heroin, but methamphetamine and cocaine, right? Stimulants, totally different types of drugs. But there's also counterfeit pills, and this is a huge problem that we're seeing now. And yes, counterfeit opiate pills like oxycodone, Roxycontin, Percocet, those kind of things. And again, fentanyl is many, many times more powerful than those, so that's dangerous. But even more dangerous is seeing fake benzodiazepines such as Xanax, a completely different classification of drug. So someone that's a drug user but not be opiate naive is now taking an incredibly powerful opiate. And to me, the scariest of all is the Adderall, right? Because Adderall, of course, is a medication for ADD, ADHD. And there are people who will illegally take Adderall who are not necessarily drug users or what we would think of as a drug user. And I mostly think about kids, about students, college students, high school students, under a lot of pressure to make grades, to perform, to get accepted into college, to keep scholarships. Somebody says, hey, got this pill, Adderall, you can take it, you can stay up all night, you can study, you can do what you need to do. Except when they take it, it's actually, again, the most powerful opiate we've ever seen on somebody that doesn't do drugs. And that's going to be it, right? It's going to overwhelm them easily. Of course, other factors, mental health conditions, physical conditions, especially that affect the heart and lungs. Using on top of opiate MAT medications, partial opiates like buprenorphine or full agonist opiates like methadone, it's going to increase the risk for overdose. And using while alone, right? If somebody overdoses but when they're by themselves, there's nobody else there to call 911 or to administer naloxone, Narcan. So, unfortunately, they're probably going to pass away. So what actually happens in an opiate overdose? So again, we all have natural opiate receptors. They're in our midbrain. And so when you take an opiate, painkiller, street drug, whatever, the way that it provides pain relief, that it provides euphoria or high, or in this case, overdose, is that it's bouncing from receptor site to receptor site in the midbrain. And what happens in an overdose is those receptor sites become so overwhelmed, so saturated with the opiates that the brain cannot do its normal job there. Its normal function there is to actually read the bloodstream for oxygen, carbon dioxide levels. It becomes so overwhelmed it can't do that. And so the brain thinks the body's already dead. So an overdose, an opiate overdose, is the brain thinking the body's already dead, right? And so there's no more breathing. I don't spend much time on these drug nickname slides. Some of these are very old. Some of these might be slightly mislabeled depending on where you're from. But I do leave it up for a moment. If you have kids or you work with kids and you hear them using these names, likely that they may be drug users, but if they're not, they're certainly very aware of drug culture. So it's important to be aware of some of these words. So fentanyl, right? Fentanyl is the synthetic opioid. We're hearing all about it because it has taken over the drug supply, not just opiates again, but it's being laced on everything. 2 out of 3 of the fatal overdoses that we're seeing nationwide, statewide, and even higher than that here in Memphis are related to fentanyl. So this is a powerful picture. The vial on the left is heroin. It's roughly a half gram of heroin. And for most human beings, that would be a toxic amount of heroin. Maybe not for your daily hardcore heroin user, but for most human beings, a half gram of heroin would kill you. The vial on the right is a fatal amount of fentanyl. You can see there's just a little bit of powder in the bottom and up the bottom of the side. Fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin, 50 times more potent. The middle vial is something called carfentanil, which is a fentanyl analog derivative that's even stronger. And this stuff started showing up just a few years ago, and everyone that was aware of it freaked out, and deservedly so. You can see that toxic amount of carfentanil in that middle vial is almost like nothing at all. And we were afraid that this was going to take over the drug supply, and it would literally just pretty much kill people left, right, up, down. Fortunately, this strongest form of fentanyl did not take over the way that we feared. Carfentanil is used as an elephant tranquilizer in legitimate use. That's how powerful it is. And I can't tell you exactly why that it didn't take over, other than my theory is that it's so powerful that even the drug suppliers said, we can't use this stuff, right? Because you think about these minuscule amounts of fentanyl, and you think about drug dealers trying to divide this up evenly amongst whatever they're cutting it with in various batches and baggies. And it's literally impossible to do without state-of-the-art lab equipment. And so that's why you'll see this variance in the potency of the fentanyl on the street, not just from batch to batch, but even bag to bag, because it's impossible to divvy it up evenly. So of course, there are people who are now addicted to fentanyl. They know they're addicted to fentanyl. That's what they're looking for. That's what they have to have, because heroin or prescription opiates are not strong enough to keep them from being in withdrawal. So they need the fentanyl. Once again, though, there are a lot of people who are consuming it by accident, laced on other drugs, in the fake pills, all that stuff. But the fentanyl is an opioid, and any opioid, an overdose can be reversed utilizing naloxone, also called Narcan, right? But an overdose with fentanyl can happen more quickly because it is more powerful. So what does an opioid overdose look like? For anyone that doesn't know, someone that's intoxicated on opiates is going to look like this. They're going to have pinpoint pupils. They're going to be scratching. They're going to be kind of out of it, nodding out, slurred speech, those kind of things. But that person is not in an overdose, at least not yet. They may go into an overdose, but at this point, they're not. The difference is the person in an overdose loses consciousness. They will no longer respond to stimuli. And again, the concern, the lethal part of the overdose is that breathing is going to stop. So breathing has either already stopped or it's heading that way. And so it's getting shallow, slow, erratic. And there's going to be possibly choking, snore-like gurgling noises. And there have been people who were in an overdose who were making those sounds, and the other folks around them thought they were okay. Rapper Lil Peep, that's what happened to him a few years ago. He was partying, took what he thought was a Xanax. It was actually a fake pill with fentanyl. He went and laid down on his bed on his tour bus. His friends kept partying. They thought he was okay. They could hear him snoring. And that young man slowly died over the course of a couple of 3-4 hours from a drug overdose, surrounded by his friends on his own tour bus. They didn't know. They didn't know. Other signs of an overdose could be vomiting, the body go limp, lack of oxygen, so fingernails, lips could turn blue, purplish, black, skin, especially the face, pale, clammy, and the pulse is eventually going to go away, right? As if the person dies, and before it's gone, it's going to be slow or erratic. So we're going to skip the stimulants for a moment, and we'll come back and we'll talk about naloxone, and that'll be how we wrap up. So stimulants, again, these nicknames, some are old, some are mislabeled, especially depending on where you're from. But if you have kids or you work with kids and you hear this stuff, that would be a concern. So stimulant overdose is also called overamping. And it's a little bit different than opioid overdose. Opioid overdose is pretty cut or dry, right? Somebody's in an overdose or they're not. And if they're in an overdose, they need medical help, they need naloxone, or they're going to die. Stimulant overdose is a little more of a spectrum, kind of a gray area, because there's a big mental health or psychological component oftentimes to a stimulant overdose. Yes, there's physical component, heart attack, stroke, seizures, but they can also be paranoia, hallucinations, panic, even psychosis. And because of the psychological aspect, yes, the amount of drug, the strength of the drug, the experience of the drug user, all that still matters, but it can also be dependent on that person's state of mind on that particular day, or the environment and the people that are around them. So risk factors, being awake too long. Well, I mean, that's, when you talk about amphetamines, particularly methamphetamine, that's kind of what that is staying up. Dehydration, not eating enough. Somebody's on stimulants, they feel like they don't need anything to drink or eat, but of course the body does. The body needs water, the body needs food, the body needs rest eventually. Without it, it will shut down. Mixing unknown substances, multiple substances, we've mentioned that several times. Heart conditions, those kind of physical things can increase the risk of a stimulant overdose. And being around people or an environment that's unsafe, that feels scary, can cause a person to become overstimulated and go into some type of mental health event. So physical symptoms, psychological symptoms, as I mentioned, I'll point out a couple. Passing out, that's not a normal reaction to stimulants. Person doing stimulants passes out, their body's shutting down. It's over, it's had too much. And then feeling paralyzed while awake is absolutely frightening. And I've had people confirm every one of these symptoms who were heavy stimulant users. So overdoses often do involve multiple different kinds of drugs. So Narcan, naloxone is only going to be for opiates, right? It's not going to help with stimulants or alcohol or benzodiazepines or whatever. 1 out of 3 of the fatal overdoses that we see in Tennessee involve an opioid and a stimulant, right? This is increasing. So what do you do when you see somebody that you believe to be in an overdose? You can assess the situation. Are they responsive? Are they conscious? If they are, they may not be in an overdose yet. They could go into one, right? They still may need your help. And you have to make sure you're safe, right? Is people around you, or, are you in danger? And also assess the environment. And that can include what's in the environment. And so fentanyl is as I've said, and is true, is extremely dangerous, extremely potent, but there is some misinformation out there about it. Fentanyl poisoning or overdose by somebody responding to an overdose situation. Stories in the national media about first responders, police officers, different people being exposed to fentanyl and going into overdose. Fortunately, most of those stories are erroneous. That's not actually what happened. Fentanyl does not easily absorb through the skin unless there's some kind of big open wound cut, right? The cut. And you're not going to inhale it just from it being, you know, in the air. Somebody would have to literally throw a lot of it into your face for you to inhale enough to get into your body. So Narcan, naloxone can be safely administered even if there's fentanyl around. Always use latex gloves if they're available. We include latex gloves in our overdose reversal kits. Always use them if they're available. Afterwards, always wash your hands with soap and hot water. Do not use hand sanitizer. It actually will not take the fentanyl off the skin. We've learned anything in the last couple of years. We've learned that we need to be washing our hands before we eat, drink, touch our face, whatever, right? So what not to do, unlike what you see in movies and TV shows, you don't put somebody in overdose in a cold bath or shower. They're unconscious, no control over their airway. They could drown. Same reason you don't try to make them vomit or give them something to eat. They're unconscious. They have no control over their airway. They could choke. There's nothing that's going to help a person in an opioid. So how does it work? Well, remember we have our opiate receptor sites in the midbrain. The naloxone, the Narcan, goes in and it has a stronger affinity. It binds more powerfully to the receptor sites. So it kicks the opiates out of the receptor sites and it locks those sites down without stimulating them. What that does is it allows the brain to resume its regular job, breathing, right? Oh no, we don't have any oxygen in our blood. And somebody will come back, they'll take that giant gulp of air. They haven't had any in a while. So for 30 to 90 minutes, the naloxone, the Narcan is going to keep those receptor sites clear so the person can breathe. Now, when somebody comes back from an overdose, they're going to go in temporary withdrawal, right? Opioid withdrawals, not nice. It's pretty nasty. And when it hits somebody all at once like that, it's pretty bad. Again, naloxone is not going to help for stimulants, okay? It's not possible to overdose on naloxone itself. Naloxone is not addictive, okay? So what does it look like? Well, we've got there the nasal sprays. You see Narcan, which is a name brand 4 milligram spray. This is what's been around. This is what you tend to see the most of. I got some right here. There's also now a newer spray called Clexato, which is an 8 milligram, a double strength spray. Why did we need a double strength spray? Because the fentanyl that's out there is so powerful that oftentimes 1 dose of Narcan is not enough. Sometimes 2 doses isn't enough. So they came out with a double strength spray. There's also an intramuscular injection naloxone that's available. Just like any intramuscular injection, you always want to give that in the outer thigh if you ever come in contact with that. We don't tend to carry the auto ejectors and those things, so I don't spend time on those, but those are around as well. So again, if someone's in an overdose, the first thing you have to determine is, are they responsive? Are they conscious? You can gently shake them, call their name. They don't respond. There's a surefire way called the sternum rub to see if somebody's conscious. Make a fist, extend your top 2 fingers, use those middle joints. You press that into the chest and you rub. That doesn't feel very good. If the person is at all conscious, they'll respond to that. Even if it's, right, even if they're out of it, if they're conscious, they'll respond to that. If someone does not respond to that, they are unconscious. And in this situation, they are very likely to be in an opiate overdose. In a lot of situations, they're likely to be in an opiate overdose. I've been told by multiple ER nurses that it is standard operating procedure now in ERs that if someone comes in and they're not sure what's wrong with them, like there's not an obvious gunshot wound or stab wound or something, the very first thing they're going to do is they're going to give them naloxone, right? Because that's how many opiate overdoses that are happening. So how do you actually use it? It's very simple. The bag peels right off in the top corner. This is a 1-shot spray. There's only 1 dose in here, so it doesn't need to be tested or primed. There's 1 shot in here. If you do that, you've wasted it, and you got to use another one if you have one. So it's ready to go. And so you peel it out, you take it out, right? Just like a nasal spray, you're holding it between these 2 fingers. You insert that into either nostril. You always want to keep the head tilted back, keep the airway clear for when they come back, and also, cleaner pathway to the brain for the medication. And you hit that red plunger on the bottom there, boom, right? Give it a go. And it can take up to 2 minutes for this stuff to take effect, which is a long, long time when somebody is literally dying in front of you, but it can take up to 2 minutes for it to take effect. Always want to call 911, right? They're going to have more Narcan. They're going to have medicines potentially for other substances the person might have taken. They're going to have medications to help with some of the withdrawal symptoms, right? So again, it may take more than 1 dose to bring somebody back. 911 may ask you to do chest compressions, possibly CPR if you've been trained, if you're comfortable doing that. Once somebody is back breathing again, whether it's 1 dose, 2 doses, whatever it might be, you want to get them in a recovery position, which is on their side, keeping the head tilted back to keep the airway clear. On the side, help them support themselves, hand under chin, bend the knee against the floor, keeping the head tilted back, making sure that they are still breathing. If you haven't called 911, certainly do it at this point while on their side. They're very likely to vomit. You want the person to vomit away from the body, not straight up where it can come back down and they could still choke on it. Want to stay with them. They're not going to remember overdosing, most likely. They may not remember any of the whole day. The longer they were out, the less they'll probably remember. They're going to be sick. They're going to be upset. You want to try to comfort them and help them stay calm. Oftentimes, opioid user, when they come back from an overdose, they don't know they overdosed, but now they're very sick. They're in withdrawal, right? They may become violent and they may want to go use to try to not be sick. Using isn't going to help them, right? The receptor sites are blocked. They're locked down with the naloxone. 30 to 90 minutes, you don't want them to use. The only thing that would happen is when the naloxone wears off and those opiates can go back to the receptor sites, they can go into another overdose, and that does happen. Another good reason to call 911. Hopefully the person would be open to getting some help, right? But you can't force somebody, right? Always tell paramedics anything you know. Again, it's going to last 30 to 90 minutes. They can have that second overdose if they use, especially if they use again, but even if they don't use again. So they could also have a heart attack if they have any pre-existing conditions. They may very well be in legitimate physical pain. They're going to be sick, right? Like I said, it's pretty nasty. So it's important to note that everybody in this situation has rights. In the state of Tennessee, we have a couple of important laws. The Tennessee Addiction Treatment Act, which allows us to use Narcan, but it also gives a person immunity from a drug prosecution on a drug possession charge one time if they've never used it. And this is a real state law. And our first responders, our police officers, they know about this. Everyone's tired of folks dying. We want people to call 911. We want people to stay alive. And then there's the Good Samaritan Act, which anyone that's been given basic instruction, which is now everyone in this presentation, that we can give this to somebody to help them without fear of being sued. We are protected civilly from being sued. We've run short on time. I said this is a lot of information. Compassion, fatigue, and burnout. I will just say this is real. Some of y'all know this. You work in the field. Burnout happens slowly over time. Compassion fatigue can happen right away when we pick up somebody else's trauma. It can happen when we see someone overdosing. We all need to talk about any new symptoms we experience, right, with our trusted folks, and we all need to have healthy coping skills, right, to recharge and relax and renew and all that good stuff so we can keep doing the work that we're doing. So there's a test here. You guys know all the answers, right? You know that there are 2 forms of naloxone available, intranasal and intramuscular. You know that you have to use more than 1 dose, that you don't leave a person alone. You always want to give that shot in the outer thigh. Naloxone is going to last 30 to 90 minutes. I only mentioned it 7 times. Naloxone is not addictive. These are all symptoms of a person overdosing. Unresponsive, no breathing, blue skin, small pinpoint pupils, right? These are all symptoms, signs of an overdose. Always call 911. Chest compression, CPR may be necessary. And the Good Samaritan Act protects us from being sued. This stuff is a prescription medicine. Every resident of Tennessee has been prescribed this by the Department of Health. That's why we can all have it. It is available at pharmacies. All the big chains carry it. A lot of the local places in Memphis do. It's $150 for 2 of these doses at a pharmacy without insurance. Insurance does cover it. TennCare covers up to 2 units a month, and it's not supposed to count toward a person's monthly prescription limit. Somebody mentioned this earlier. We know this stuff works. Tens of thousands of people have gotten a second chance at life because of naloxone, right? And in this new the new funding that the government's rolling out, they announced today, even more money is going to go to naloxone, to Narcan and Cloxata. So that's fantastic, right? So any of you guys that want to pick this up, you're welcome to come join us. On April 30th, we have the Drug Take Back Day, as been mentioned. We're also doing a stop event, and we're going to be at South 3rd Street. 3214 South 3rd Street. We've been showing that from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. You can come by and show me you were in the training. We'll get you an overdose reversal kit. We'll be out there with music, free food in the community, trying to bring awareness, trying to keep people, again, alive and safe. We've seen a spike in overdose deaths out there, heavily attributed to the counterfeit pills. We have resources. We talked about these different resources that are available through our coalition and statewide. Take advantage of them. Anyone that so chooses, that cares to, you can scan this BitLi code and take about 2 minutes to fill out a evaluation form on the presentation that I just gave. Appreciate that if you've got the time to do it. And that pretty much wraps us up if we have time for any questions. There's a question here. Why do you think there's more attention now to overdoses than in the 90s? Because it's only gotten worse. We're losing over 100,000 people a year now to opioid overdoses. So the problem's only gotten worse over time. But it took a long time to bring this attention. Unfortunately, a lot of people have had to die to bring the attention to this issue. How likely is it to be addicted to a substance due to hard family upbringing? As I mentioned, that's a lot of the factors that can go into it: the environment, the trauma, the grief, those kind of things. Could the possibility?
Question, David. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
So we were wondering, a lot of people say that Narcan just enables people to continue using. What would you say to that?
I would say that throughout time, it's been demonstrated that people are going to do what people are going to do. We tried to prohibit alcohol. We've tried to prohibit a lot of things, and it doesn't seem to work. There are a lot of complex factors that go into why people abuse substances. We've mentioned some of them. There's also a lot of socioeconomic, societal things. People are going to do what they're going to do. We've seen that demonstrated over time. Right before Narcan, naloxone was widely available, people were overdosing. There's a reason why we've gotten the funding that we have now, the awareness that we have now. People will die without this stuff. No one is going to choose to be a heroin addict or a fentanyl addict because they know there's Narcan to potentially reverse their overdose. That's just not how that works.
Perfect. Thank you, David. I'm going to pass it over to Olivia to give our final presentation.
Actually, before we pass it to Olivia, thank you, David. We are going to hear from two more of our sponsors. First, we're going to hear from Lakeside. All right. In 1969, Lakeside Behavioral Health System opened its doors with one mission in mind: to provide specialized behavioral health care and substance use treatment in a welcoming environment for people in search of healing. Our 37-acre campus, located on the outskirts of Memphis, features a 365-bed facility designed to make recovery an accessible, effective reality in the lives of our patients. Lakeside offers a specialty program known as The Landing for adults struggling with alcohol, drug, and other substance abuse disorders. The Landing offers individuals the opportunity to engage in a 12-step model treatment program with a 28-day continuum of care. Medically monitored detox, short-term residential treatment, partial hospitalization, and intensive outpatient options are available for those seeking help at Lakeside for a substance use disorder. Confidential, no-cost assessments are available 24/7. Thank you so much to Lakeside, to Jennifer and Kayla over at Lakeside. I've put Jennifer's contact information up on the screen. Please get that if you'd like to know more about their services. Lakeside is an asset in the Memphis community. And next, we are going to hear from our final sponsor, which is First Step Recovery. We will be right back.
My name's Grace Pipkin. I work for First Step Recovery Centers. We opened 11 years ago, and I've worked there ever since. We opened Judicare 6 years ago, which is a residential program for the 3 recovery courts here in Shelby County. We have Veterans Court, Drug Court, and Mental Health Court. And then First Step Recovery is an IOP program. When First Step opened up 11 years ago, the majority of people that we saw were methamphetamines, cocaine, some benzos, and that lasted a few years, and then it quickly developed into heroin, which changed to fentanyl. Of course, actually the beginning was just medication. So we saw Loratab a lot. And then things shifted quickly to fentanyl, which increased homelessness, illegal activity where they were having consequences, overdoses, terrible withdrawals. So as a nation, we had to shift quickly to how are we going to treat them. Yeah, we saw moms losing their children in the midst of grief. It had dire consequences. Oftentimes, we would get phone calls from individuals who needed help before they went through the painful effects of withdrawal. We would refer them to inpatient detox, which still continues to be difficult because they're just, in the state of Tennessee, it's very limited beds for the ones that are uninsured. They have other obstacles like child care and losing a job and things like that. So if they're willing to get into an inpatient detox, we try to accommodate that the best we can. And then it becomes hopefully a wraparound service where they can come into intensive outpatient. We've been fortunate enough to collaborate with Dr. Bill Brook at Alliance, and he sees our clients and provides the medication and his services while they receive treatment with us. So I guess it was maybe 5 years ago that Walter Williams, our director, pulled us all into a staff meeting and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to provide MAT services. And we, we quickly had to adapt from an abstinent-based program to medication-assisted treatment. Our staff was great at it. We learned new philosophies. Most of the community has. It's been a big learning curve. This was new to us. This was new to the entire community, including the addicts. And so we made mistakes and kind of learned as we're still learning. We have to go, okay, this person is relapsing on their medication. This person we need to have more Narcan out in the community. Although, that being said, Memphis Area Prevention Coalition has been phenomenal at supplying us Narcan and the community. So we learned the importance of that, and it has definitely saved some lives, especially over at Judicare. We've had instances where we've had to use Narcan. And that's been incredible. And that gives us the opportunity to go, okay, well, what happened? How did this happen? And we learn, okay, this client probably needs buprenorphine. Let's evaluate that. Let's send them over to Alliance to see if they can evaluate him and see the same need we think we see. 3 years ago, we received a federal grant and a state grant that was able to help us provide the needs of the community with addiction. Without that, we wouldn't have anything. So we were really fortunate to receive those funds. The state's been generous. It's going to have to continue to be generous because this epidemic isn't going away. It's not going away. But hopefully our program of providing MAT services is putting a dent in it. I see life come back to people's eyes, and that's really why we're all in it. We are First Step Recovery Centers. We are the sister agency of Mid-South Sober Living, and we also have Judicare. We see past the stigma of MAT, and we are here to help individuals with addiction.
All right. Our mission at First Step is to facilitate and provide a continuum of recovery for those dealing with addiction and mental health issues. Thank you so much, First Step, for sponsoring, and Lakeside for sponsoring our event today. Thank you so much to AHS, Lakeside, First Step Recoveries, Bradford, UT Clinical Health, Graceland Recovery, the Memphis Redbirds, ABC 24, and our diamond sponsors, Shelby County Health Department and Summit Behavioral Health.